Everyone in Millbrook Crossing, Kansas, knew that the ancient well behind the Hargrove barn had been sealed for nearly 70 years. No one touched it, and no one spoke about it except when warning children to stay away from the warped wooden planks covering its mouth. So when 27-year-old Clara Hargrove rented a backhoe and told the operator to begin digging at that exact spot, the news traveled across half the county before lunchtime. Her neighbor Earl Tibbetts stood leaning against his pickup truck at the fence line, laughing so hard that he had to remove his cap and wipe the sweat from his forehead. "That well's been dry since Eisenhower was president," he called out. "Your great-grandfather sealed it for a reason." Later that afternoon, when Clara stopped at the local co-op to purchase diesel fuel, 3 farmers were already laughing about the story Earl had repeated twice at the counter. Clara did not respond. She paid for the fuel, returned to the farm, and watched the backhoe bucket bite into the hard Kansas earth. Her jaw tightened in the way it always did when she had made a decision and no longer cared whether anyone understood it. That was what frustrated people most. Clara refused to explain herself. She did not explain the excavation to Earl. She did not explain it to her father, who had called from Wichita and asked whether she had lost her mind. She did not explain it to the county extension office, which had contacted her twice to ask what kind of permit she believed she needed. The truth was that 1 week earlier, Clara had been clearing the attic of the farmhouse after inheriting the property from her grandmother. Inside an old cedar chest, beneath faded quilts and bundles of brittle letters, she discovered a water-stained farm ledger. Most of its pages contained seed prices, rainfall measurements, livestock records, and observations about the weather. Near the middle of the book, however, one sentence stood alone on an otherwise empty page. "The well remembers what the fields forgot." The handwriting belonged to her great-grandmother, Vesta Lindquist Hargrove, who had married into the family during the most difficult years of the Dust Bowl. Clara had shown the ledger to no one. She was not prepared to explain why the sentence had echoed through her thoughts every night since she found it. Why would a young woman who had only recently taken responsibility for 240 acres spend most of her savings reopening a hole that everyone considered useless? Why did she believe something valuable remained beneath those decaying boards? What had Vesta meant when she wrote that the well remembered something the fields had forgotten? And why, after only 3 days of digging, did strange objects begin appearing in the spoil pile? Objects that caused even the backhoe operator to shut down his machine and call Clara over. Anyone who had ever been laughed at for trusting an instinct others could not understand would recognize the kind of stubbornness guiding Clara. It was not loud stubbornness. It did not require arguments, speeches, or dramatic gestures. It was the quiet determination of someone who believed the land was trying to tell her something and who was willing to keep digging until she understood. The first object uncovered by the backhoe was not soil. It was a block of hand-cut limestone, carefully dressed square along one face, the kind of stone no one simply found by accident in the middle of a Kansas field. Clara climbed into the shallow excavation herself and brushed the dirt from the surface with her work glove. Even rows of chisel marks appeared beneath the mud. Their precision surprised her. The stone had not been placed casually. Someone had shaped and positioned it with enormous care. This well had not been dug with a shovel, a rope, and blind hope. Someone had engineered it to survive. Approximately 3 feet deeper, the backhoe bucket struck metal. The operator stopped immediately. Together they uncovered a wide length of rusted pipe running horizontally from the well shaft toward the lower hayfield. It was too large and too deliberately positioned to have belonged to an ordinary household plumbing system. Clara stood with her hands on her hips, studying the angle. Most old farm wells in that part of Kansas were simple stone-lined shafts from which water was drawn with a bucket and rope, or, later, a hand pump. But this well had been designed to move water somewhere else. That evening, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table and opened Vesta's ledger beneath the brass lamp her grandmother had used for reading. Vesta's notes documented failing wheat, dust storms, sick cattle, and months when no rain fell at all, buried between entries about crop yields and wind direction. Clara found the name of a man no one in the family had ever mentioned. Holt, according to Vesta. Holt was a federal soil conservation engineer sent to Kansas through one of the New Deal agricultural programs. His assignment was to demonstrate experimental water-saving techniques on farms close to being abandoned. Vesta wrote that he spent an entire summer working on the Hargrove property. One passage read, "Meister, Holt says what he has built will outlast all of us, provided someone remembers where to look." The following morning, Clara drove into town and visited the County Historical Society. She asked whether any agricultural records from the mid-1930s had survived. The volunteer behind the desk directed her to the courthouse basement, where dozens of cardboard boxes sat beneath exposed pipes. The records smelled of mildew, dust, and damp paper. Clara spent 2 afternoons opening files no one had requested in decades. Near closing time on the second day, she found a typed federal report dated 1936. It described a Soil Conservation Service demonstration project designed to intercept water from a shallow limestone seam and distribute it underground across drought-damaged farmland. The entire system operated through gravity. No electric pump, no fuel, and no mechanical pressure. Only stone, elevation, filtration, and carefully placed pipes. At the top of the report was the name of the participating property, Hargrove Farm, Millbrook Crossing, Kansas. Clara read the line twice, then returned to the beginning and read every word. The sealed well behind her barn had never been merely a well. It had been the central chamber of an experimental irrigation system nearly forgotten by history. Once the discovery gave Clara a reason to continue. The land seemed determined to test whether she truly meant it. A heavy spring storm arrived overnight and transformed the excavation into a basin of mud. Water poured across the work site, and sections of the old shaft, weakened by frost, tree roots, and decades of neglect, collapsed inward and buried nearly 2 days of careful digging. The rented pump used to keep the hole dry seized without warning and had to be hauled to a repair shop in Newton, delaying the work and draining more money from Clara's rapidly shrinking savings. Earl Tibbets no longer laughed from the other side of the fence. Instead, he shook his head whenever he passed. "You're going to hurt yourself chasing an old family story," he told her one morning. Clara looked up from the mud covering her boots. "Thank you for worrying about me." Then she returned to clearing loose stone from the shaft. Her older brother, Mason, drove down from Wichita after their father told him what she was doing. Mason was 32 and worked as a project manager for a construction company. He arrived intending to persuade Clara to stop before she spent everything she had inherited. He walked around the excavation, inspected the unstable walls, and asked whether she understood how dangerous the project had become. Clara handed him Vesta's ledger and the federal report. He read both documents at the kitchen table that evening, but remained unconvinced. The following morning, however, he climbed onto the post-hole auger to help trace the buried pipe. 2 days later, he no longer asked Clara to stop. Once he saw the dressed limestone, the deliberate slope of the pipe, and the precision of the construction, he understood why she could not walk away. The system had been built by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Another problem soon emerged. An old plat map from the courthouse showed the main pipe running south toward a pond that had disappeared decades earlier. When Clara's crew followed the actual line, however, it curved west toward a low swale beside the windbreak. That area had always been peculiar. Even in August, when the upper fields hardened and cracked, the ground near the swale remained soft beneath the grass. The contradiction troubled Clara more than the mud or the broken pump. The official map and the buried pipe could not both be correct. Still, she continued digging. The breakthrough came when the crew cleared the collapsed portion of the well and uncovered an opening in the shaft wall. It led into a narrow side chamber. Ordinary farm wells did not contain side chambers. Clara lowered herself into the excavation with a rope secured around her waist while Mason remained above, watching every movement. Inside the chamber, she found layers of washed gravel packed between 2 courses of dressed limestone. Dark material filled the spaces beneath the gravel. At first, she thought it was rotted wood. Then she broke apart a small piece between her fingers. It was charcoal. The chamber had been built as a filter. Water entered through the limestone seam, passed through gravel and charcoal, and flowed into the distribution pipes with most of its sediment removed. The design had been constructed decades before terms such as aquifer recharge. Passive filtration and subsurface irrigation became common in county agricultural meetings. Clara called the extension office again. This time, she did not ask about permits. She asked for a hydrogeologist. A young field specialist named Dr. Lena Morris arrived 2 days later with water testing equipment, geological maps, and the cautious expression of someone accustomed to farmers exaggerating unusual discoveries. After examining the chamber, Lena climbed into the shaft herself. She remained below for nearly 20 minutes. When she finally emerged, her clothes were covered with mud and her expression had changed completely. She did not laugh. She did not dismiss the structure as an abandoned farm well. Instead, she asked Clara whether anyone had ever surveyed the limestone beneath the property. Over the next several hours, Lena collected samples, measured the angle of the pipe, and examined the surrounding ground. She asked Clara about the fields, about places that stayed green longer in summer, and about patches of soil that remained soft after weeks without rain. Clara pointed toward the lower hayfield, the west pasture, and the strange swale near the windbreak. Lena made careful notes but offered no immediate conclusion. Before leaving, she told Clara not to disturb the deepest section of the chamber until she returned with additional equipment. That night, Clara could not sleep. The house was silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional groan of old timber cooling after sunset. She sat at the table with Vesta's ledger open in front of her and traced the faded pencil sentence with one finger. The well remembers what the fields forgot. For the first time, the words no longer felt like a riddle. They felt like instructions. Vesta had not expected someone to understand immediately. She had simply trusted that, one day, someone in the family would pay attention long enough to ask the right questions. What Lena explained when she returned transformed Clara's entire understanding of the farm she had known since childhood. Beneath the Hargrove property lay a perched limestone shelf holding a thin but reliable seam of groundwater. It was not connected to the deep regional aquifer supplying most modern wells in the township. During drought years, the regional aquifer dropped quickly as farmers increased pumping. But the shallow seam beneath the Hargrove farm behaved differently. Rainwater entered cracks in the limestone and moved slowly through the rock. Because the shelf rested above a less permeable layer, the water accumulated there instead of sinking immediately into the deeper aquifer. The volume was modest, but the flow remained surprisingly consistent. Engineer Holt had discovered the seam in 1936. He built the stone shaft to intercept it, passed the water through layers of gravel and charcoal, and installed clay and iron pipes carrying it toward lower portions of the farm. The entire system functioned through gravity. It required no electricity, no gasoline, and no mechanical pump, only elevation, maintenance, and time. The discovery explained a mystery that had followed the Hargrove family for 3 generations. It explained why their lower hayfield stayed green a few weeks longer than neighboring fields during dry summers. It explained why the west pasture rarely became as brittle as Earl Tibbet's land. It explained why certain rows of corn sometimes survived a scorching July, even when crops planted only a short distance away curled and died. Water had been moving beneath the farm all along. The system had never stopped completely. It had merely become clogged with silt, roots, and collapsed soil. Lena warned Clara that restoring the network would require patience. If they cleared the pipes too aggressively, they could damage sections made from brittle clay. If they forced water into the system under pressure, they might destroy the original joints. Every obstruction had to be removed by hand or with low-pressure flushing. Clara accepted the conditions immediately. Over the following weeks, she, Mason, and Lena's team worked through one section at a time. They removed roots, washed sediment from the filtration chamber, and replaced only the pieces that had crumbled beyond repair. Whenever possible, they preserved Holt's original materials and construction. At first, nothing changed. The chamber remained damp, but still, Earl watched from his field, and a few people at the co-op began whispering that the young Hargrove woman had spent a small fortune uncovering an elaborate pile of old stone. Clara heard the comments but ignored them. She had already learned that laughter often arrived before understanding. One morning, while she was clearing silt from a narrow outlet, a dark thread of water appeared between 2 stones. It was so small that she thought she had imagined it. Then another drop followed. Within minutes, Water formed a steady trickle along the bottom of the chamber. Clara called Mason, who knelt beside her in the mud and watched without speaking. The water passed through the gravel bed, entered the old pipe, and disappeared into the darkness exactly as Holt had intended. During the following days, moisture slowly spread along the buried lines. The soil above one of the old outlets became damp enough to hold the imprint of Clara's boot. A strip of grass near the lower hayfield deepened from pale yellow to green. The system was working almost exactly as it had 90 years earlier. Lena invited 2 colleagues from the State Geological Survey to examine the site. They installed temporary monitoring equipment and confirmed that the restored system was drawing only from the perch seam, not from the deeper aquifer used by neighboring farms. The flow was slow but continuous. It did not flood the fields or replace rainfall. Instead, it maintained moisture beneath the surface, reducing the speed at which the soil dried during hot weather. News spread quickly through Millbrook Crossing. This time, people did not arrive to laugh. They came to see. Trucks began appearing along the county road in the evenings. Farmers stood at the edge of the excavation, staring at the carefully fitted limestone and asking questions about the filters, the slope, and the buried outlets. Earl Tibbets visited one evening after most of the others had left. He stood at the edge of the cleared shaft and examined the stonework for a long time. "I've farmed this ground for 50 years, he said eventually. "I've never seen anything built like that." Clara did not remind him of what he had said at the fence line. She did not ask for an apology. She simply nodded and told him to watch his step near the loose soil. By harvest season, the lower Hargrove fields retained moisture weeks longer than most farms in the township. The difference was visible from the county road. While neighboring hayfields faded to brittle brown, Clara's lower acreage remained green enough for a second cutting. Corn planted above one of the restored lines developed stronger stalks and fuller ears than corn on the upper slope. The system did not make the farm immune to drought, but it gave the soil time. And in a hard year, time could mean the difference between a reduced harvest and a failed one. In May, neighbors had laughed at the young woman digging up a sealed well. By October, some of those same neighbors were asking whether capped wells on their own properties might conceal forgotten systems. The County Historical Society officially identified the Hargrove structure as one of the last intact Soil Conservation Service demonstration projects in Kansas. Photographs of the stone chamber, the original pipes and Vesta's ledger were added to the county archive. Mason, who had driven from Wichita to prevent his sister from making an expensive mistake, began taking evening courses in water resource management. He later joined Clara in developing a restoration plan that preserved the original system while allowing modern monitoring equipment to be added without damaging the stonework. The low swale near the windbreak provided the final answer to the mystery of the inaccurate plat map. Lena's team excavated the soft ground carefully and found a second filtration outlet buried beneath nearly a foot of silt. The outlet proved that Holt had altered the pipe route during construction. After working directly with the slope of the land, he realized the surveyor's original plan would not distribute the water effectively. Rather than obeying a flawed drawing, he changed the course of the system. Even the engineer responsible for the project had trusted the reality of the ground more than the certainty of a plan on paper. Clara thought about that discovery for days. It was another lesson hidden inside the construction itself. Holt had not treated his design as something sacred. He had observed, adjusted, and allowed the land to correct him. By the following spring, the county extension office began bringing farmers to the Hargrove property. The restored system became a practical demonstration of passive water management designed decades before rural electrification reached many parts of Kansas. Visitors walked along marked sections of the buried pipe, examined the filtration chamber, and watched monitoring gauges recording the slow movement of groundwater. Lena explained that the old design could not simply be copied onto every farm. It depended on local geology, elevation, and soil structure. The lesson was not that every sealed well concealed a miracle. The lesson was that older farmers and engineers had often understood their land more deeply than later generations realized, and that forgotten infrastructure deserved investigation before it was dismissed as useless. Several families with sealed and half-remembered wells began researching their own properties. Some found nothing more than ordinary dry shafts. Others discovered stone-lined cisterns, drainage channels, and buried collection systems built by relatives whose knowledge had never been written down. This time, no one laughed across the fence when digging began. Earl brought his grandson to the Hargrove farm one Saturday morning to see the stone chamber. He explained how water moved through the gravel, charcoal and buried pipes as if he had known about it for years. Clara overheard him but said nothing. She never turned the discovery into a performance. She never demanded apologies from the people who had mocked her, and she never stood at the co-op reminding anyone that she had been right. She simply continued observing the land, studying Vesta's notes and allowing the restored fields to speak for her. Over time, the well everyone had considered useless became the landmark people pointed toward when explaining why the Hargrove farm endured dry years better than most. School groups visited during the spring. Agricultural students came to document the original construction. Historians interviewed Clara about the ledger and the discovery, though she always insisted that the story belonged as much to Vesta and Holt as it did to her. Without Vesta's decision to preserve one strange sentence, the well might have remained sealed for another generation. Without Holt's willingness to study the limestone and change his plan when the land disagreed with the map, the system might never have worked. Without Clara's willingness to be laughed at, neither of them would have been remembered. George Washington Carver once observed that when a person performs the common things of life in an uncommon way, the world eventually pays attention. Clara Hargrove had never intended to command anyone's attention. She only wanted to understand one sentence written by a woman she had never met, but whose careful observations had survived inside a forgotten ledger. The well remembers what the fields forgot, by paying close attention to something ordinary, a sealed hole in the ground that everyone else had stopped noticing. Clara uncovered knowledge her family had unknowingly lived above for nearly 90 years. The well had remembered the buried water. The fields had remembered where it flowed. Vesta had remembered enough to leave behind a sentence. All the story needed was someone young enough to question what everyone accepted, stubborn enough to endure their laughter, and patient enough to keep digging. Sometimes the most valuable things are not truly hidden. They are simply ignored for so long that people forget how to see them. If this story changed the way you think about the forgotten corners of your own land, subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. We are dedicated to uncovering the history, knowledge, and quiet wisdom that time has nearly buried. By supporting these stories, you help preserve lessons from the past and plant seeds for the future. Another forgotten secret is waiting to be uncovered very soon.